last week we learned about giving up our addictions, and this week we're going to talk about giving up our idolatry of money. Affluenza. Dysfunctional relationship with wealth or money that can strike anyone regardless of economic level. An epidemic of stress, overwork, waste, and indebtedness caused by dogged pursuit of the American dream. And I love the last one, the incessant need to spend money we don't have on things we don't need to impress people we don't even like. Affluenza, the term kind of came in the news recently about there was a young boy, teenage 16-year-old kid who got drunk one night and his friends and drove and killed 4 people. The lawyer came up with this affluenza defense claiming that because the kid had grown up in this place of privilege that he couldn't tell right from wrong anymore and therefore his sentence should be lighter. So not such a great story, but the point being is that that type of wrong thinking, and I just want to go back to the segment that the American dream, the reason we're so particularly vulnerable to affluence is because we happen to live in a country that is blessed with lots of opportunity, yes, to this day, but a lot of our identities, because we come from so many different places, that we tend to often our identities are so wrapped up in what we have. It has some bad consequences. People who are really concerned and wrapped up in their addiction to money, of needing more and having more, can become very self-centered. You end up in the zero-sum game of if I win, you lose. If you win, I lose. And that is a clear threat to the social order. I would say a big part of probably what happened in economic crisis was due to this affluence, this need for more and more and more and more, when clearly you have enough and enough and enough. And we saw what happened when greed and unethical competition, even if it's legal. We're not talking just about what's legal, but what's ethical, and sometimes I think we have a hard time telling the difference in our business world. We often think that if it's legal, it's ethical, and I would argue that that is simply a myth of our current society. So what are some of the causes of affluenza? Frederick Buechner speaks a lot of the myth of scarcity. And the myth of scarcity is born of a deep emotion of fear, right? I mean, I think, I know my mom, going through depression, still lives with a sense of fear that somehow or another she's not going to have enough. And so you see a little bit of hoarding tendencies, to that because of that fear that something's going to change dramatically. And I would imagine growing up and living through that time, it would be a logical consequence of having that fear. More is better, and we live in the place of the 0.1% of the world, not the 0.01% of the world. And we see homes, just massive homes that you can't imagine how anyone could live in 30 rooms at a time, because you can only be in one. And the other myth of scarcity is that's just the way it is, and that's actually the most toxic, because anytime you make the statement that's just the way it is, that's actually a statement that nothing can change. And if you can't believe anything can change, well, that's a quick path to hopeless and despair. This is a chart that I pulled off some research, which is really kind of interesting, because indeed, if you are, this is American incomes here, if indeed you don't have enough, your annual income is below a certain amount, you need more to be happy. Because, in the lower levels, you worry about health care, you worry about your cars breaking down, you worry about your jobs, you worry about all kinds of things. So indeed, lower end, more money is better. But then it's very interesting, you get to a place, and according to this research, they show that an annual income of $75,000, more than that, it starts becoming diminishing returns. In other words, the extra stress and work required in order to gain those incremental dollars actually decrease happiness. And also, too, the more you have, the more you need to worry about, right? I mean, think about it, the more, you know, your insurance costs go up. You know, it's like just more mental stress to take care of things. So there's a real message there that more isn't really more, and that you believe this myth, even given evidence to the contrary. Social inequality. This is a huge one that you hear a lot on the news about. And the USA is way out there in terms of our income. Inequality in the U.S. is very, very high. But you also see that we don't really have very good health and social good outcomes. And this is a real problem. And that's why there's been lots of talk about raising minimum wage in this country, because it actually solves some of those ills that are identified in the prior slide, where you raise people's standard of living to a certain amount, a lot of those health and social wearable problems actually become much, much less. And it's somewhat of an embarrassment, I think, as an American, to look at those statistics. Many of you know that our daughter recently married a Danish man and moved to Copenhagen last summer. And Barney and I had the privilege of honor, really enjoy visiting her there last October. And indeed, there's, you know, you could call it, you know, socialist if you want, society. But there's just a much smaller disparity between the rich and the poor in those countries. And they don't really hold on to things as much. I mean, Christina says that pretty much everyone values family dinner time. Because having more just means you're paying more taxes, and there's a lot, and the social safety net is so high that no one really worries about health care or retirement, because it's all taken care of, you know, for the long run. So all that stress is gone. And so everyone pretty much stops and has dinner, which is such a rarity in this country. And when she's talking about where to have her children, at least in raising young children, you know, I told her, I said, honestly, Fairfield County is a tough place to raise young kids. If you want to continue working, it means finding a nanny or expensive, help, babysitting or whatever. So it makes it difficult to make it affordable. Oftentimes, your spouse has to work very long hours in order to pay the bills, to pay for the babysitter and everything else, and it's kind of a tough cycle. I've taught enough parenting classes to know how challenging it is for wives to be home all day long, women who maybe left active careers, highly educated, to stay home with children when their husbands don't come home until the kids are long put to bed. It's not a real great formula for happiness. So we can see all these things, and sometimes it means getting out of our own comfort zones, our own self-awareness of where we are, to really identify that what we define as normal here, globally, is not normal. I consume, therefore I am. This goes to identity. That Tiger Woods ad came out after his little fiasco, and it was really quite controversial. And so people, I mean, I know all my golfer friends, prior to that fiasco, saw Tiger Woods as a mini god in the world. And whether that's basketball with Kobe and all these people, Lance Armstrong, but what happens to many of these people? Many of these people were, funded by, supported by Nike, because so much of what their goal is to make you identify with their product. So if you wear that Nike hat, then by identity, you are a winner. Everybody wants to be a winner. Harley Davidson's going to get you hot chicks. And of course, the never-ending need for women to wear the latest and the greatest fashions in order to maintain a certain identity, clearly not mine. Trusting God or God. And this comes down to our lack of faithfulness. No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money, or God and mammon is put in many biblical versions, and mammon, in much of the Holy Scriptures, is really almost defined as an evil. So choosing one or the other is very difficult. And does it mean that money is evil? We never say that. It's when it becomes your idol that it becomes evil. And I show the picture of the loaves and fishes because I always love that story in the sense that the disciples were so unbelieving and so untrusting of Jesus' ability to feed those multitudes on that mountaintop that day. And so a little boy comes forth with a couple of fishes and a few loaves, and Jesus multiplies that. And I think once you can really believe that story, that there's always enough, so much of anxiety about money and the addiction to money can go away. But it's also very interesting that right after this story is when they're in a boat and the storm comes, and the disciples still don't really learn their lesson, do they? They immediately come to Jesus and want him to stop the race. And they're like, what the heck? What do I need to do for you to believe that there is enough for everybody? Even in the world, when we talk about world hunger and everything, believe me or not, there is enough for everybody. It's really just distribution that is the problem. And when we hoard more for ourselves, there's just simply less for everybody else. So, the alternatives. The wonderful thing is that we are given our alternatives. We're given the kingdom of God and as the body of Christ. And that is really wonderful. This is really brings up our image of the community table. And I really love the community table. Just to me, that implies the fact that there's God above, who loves us profoundly, who sets a feast in front of us that is abundant, that is consumed. You will never be hungry. It is also the place where we come together in our own church, our own very special place, to be that body of Christ, to be one together. But it's also the place where I always love the fact that when I'm consuming the elements, that I'm doing it with many, many Christians around the world. And by taking on that identity, instead of the Ralph Lauren, Nike, Harley-Davidson identity, this one will never change. This one is everlasting, never ending. Living outwardly. And I brought up the Lord's Field because I really think that that's where we also have the message of countering self-centeredness and cultivating hospitality, which is outward. Jesus came to that table right before Last Supper, which we'll all be celebrating soon. But the profound message that we are never to forget, and that he went from there to his arrest and crucifixion. And for us to realize what Jesus did for us, so we can certainly remember that humility and the self-sacrifice that it all takes. And if that isn't a powerful antidote to affluenza, I don't know what else is. And I think it's why we are Christians in our beliefs and in our actions. Living simply. Not a call to poverty, but rather to give out of our abundance. And many of the great religions, besides Christianity, speak to this probably more profoundly than we do. I grew up in the Greek Orthodox Church, and even though the church we went to was like in the inner city of Chicago, really the neighborhoods were not so great. They're on the south side. We would drive through these very poor neighborhoods to get to the church that I went to when I was very young. And we walked in these churches, and it was gold everywhere, And even as a little child, there was a real disconnect between what I was learning in my Sunday school classes and what my church looked like. So now I'm in the Pilgrim Church, and there are truly times when I miss some of the visuals. But there is truly a disconnect, and I think that living simply is a wonderful message for us to take into our story, and also to The word philanthropy means love of people. And it means really using less of the planet so that others can have more. And study after study has shown a direct correlation between happiness and gratitude. And I'm going to show this little video clip right now because I think it's really great. Answer the questions. It's a gentleman from Harvard who has done some work on asking us, does money create happiness?
And I want to suggest today that in fact that's wrong, and that I'm at a business school, so that's what we do. So that's wrong.
At least get the audio. Yeah. I don't know when I get the video.
So I want to talk today about money and happiness, which are two things that a lot of us spend a lot of our time thinking about, either trying to earn them or trying to increase them. And a lot of us resonate with this phrase, so we see it in religions and self-help books, that money can't buy happiness. And I want to suggest today that in fact that's wrong, and that I'm at a business school, so that's what we do. So that's wrong. And in fact, if you think that, you're actually just not spending it right. So that instead of spending it the way you usually spend it, maybe if you spent it differently, that might work a little bit better. And before I tell you the ways that you can spend it that will make you happier, let's think about the ways we usually spend it that don't, in fact, make us happier. We had a little natural experiment. So CNN a little while ago wrote this interesting article on what happens to people when they win the lottery. Turns out people think when they win the lottery their lives are going to be amazing. This article is about how their lives get ruined. So what happens when people win the lottery is, number one, they spend all the money and go into debt. And number two, all of their friends and everyone they've ever met find them and bug them for money. And it ruins their social relationships, in fact. So they have more debt and worse friendships than they had before they won the lottery. What was interesting about the article was people started commenting on the article, readers of the thing. And instead of talking about how it had made them realize that money doesn't lead to happiness, everyone instantly started saying, you know what I would do if I won the lottery? And fantasizing about what they do. And here's just two of the ones that we saw that are just really interesting to think about. One person wrote in, when I win, I'm going to buy my own little mountain and have a little house on top. And another person wrote, I would fill a big bathtub with money and get in the tub while smoking a big fat cigar and sipping a glass of champagne. This is even worse now. Then I'd have a picture taken and dozens of glossies made. Anyone begging for money or trying to extort from me would receive a copy of the picture and nothing else. And so many of the comments were exactly of this type, where people got money, and in fact, it made them antisocial. So I told you that it ruins people's lives and that their friends bug them. It also, money often makes us feel very selfish, and we do things only for ourselves. And we said, well, maybe the reason that money doesn't make us happy is that we're always spending it on the wrong things, and in particular, that we're always spending it on ourselves. And we thought, I wonder what would happen if we made people spend more of their money on other people. So instead of being antisocial with your money, what if you were a little bit more pro-social with your money? And we thought, let's make people do it and see what happens. So let's have some people do what they usually do and spend money on themselves, and let's make some people give money away and measure their happiness and see if in fact they get happier. So the first way that we did this, on one Vancouver morning, we went out on the campus at University of British Columbia, and we approached people and said, do you want to be in an experiment? And they said yes. We asked them how happy they were, and then we gave them an envelope. And one of the envelopes had things in it that said, by 5 p.m. today, spend this money on yourself. So we gave some examples of what you could spend it on. Other people in the morning got a slip of paper that said, by 5 p.m. today, spend this money on somebody else. Also inside the envelope was money, and we manipulated how much money we gave them. So some people got this slip of paper and $5. Some people got this slip of paper and $20. We let them go about their day. They did whatever they wanted to do. We found out that they did in fact spend it in the way that we asked them to. We called them up at night and asked them, what'd you spend it on, and how happy do you feel now? What did they spend it on? Well, these are college undergrads, so a lot of what they spent it on for themselves was things like earrings and makeup. One woman said she bought a stuffed animal for her niece. People gave money to homeless people. Huge effect here of Starbucks. So if you give undergraduates $5, it looks like coffee to them, and they run over to Starbucks and spend it as fast as they can. But some people bought a coffee for themselves the way they usually would, but other people said that they bought a coffee for somebody else. So the very same purchase, just targeted toward yourself or targeted toward somebody else. What did we find when we called them back at the end of the day? People who spend money on other people got happier. People who spend money on themselves, nothing happened. It didn't make them less happy, it just didn't do much for them. And the other thing we saw is that the amount of money doesn't matter that much. So people thought that $20 would be way better than $5. In fact, it doesn't matter how much money you spent. What really matters is that you spent it on somebody else rather than on yourself. We see this again and again when we give people money to spend on other people instead of on themselves. Of course, these are undergraduates in Canada, not the world's most representative population. They're also fairly wealthy and affluent and all these other sorts of things. We wanted to see if this holds true everywhere in the world or just among wealthy countries. So we went, in fact, to Uganda and ran a very similar experiment.
Undo.
Now I don't know what to do. We've got a mouse up there, but now we don't have one here. Oh, there you go.
So I want to talk today about money.
Oh, technology. Affluenza.
Man, I don't get my PowerPoints now.
How did we get the PowerPoint back up before? I turned off this and turned it back on, right?
Well, we can have a conversation. That's okay. We'll just talk. That's okay. I think the main points were made that affluenza, fear, identity, inward thinking rather than outward thinking, and trusting externals rather than God, or even ourselves, which we talked about last week. Anybody have any questions or comments? If you want anything particular that...
What happened in Uganda?
So what happened in Uganda was actually what they found was very, very similar. So they found that this important, which is really very fascinating. There's a lot of research being done and trying to, now that they have like MRIs of brains to see what lights up and what doesn't light up when people do things, they're trying to really understand why people do what they do. And I love that last video because what it shows was that we are much happier when we spend our money on somebody else than we do on ourselves. Which is really we all know that here, but to know that is actually how we're hardwired, it's really quite fascinating to me. So then they actually took this, then they to the other countries, and then they actually did the research in companies. and tried to get people to, they gave them money and said, you can spend money on a coworker today, or you can go buy, do something for yourself. And that same philosophy created better teamwork within teams until they realized that that was a very powerful driver for people. And so, that outward thing that we're talking about is so basic to, I think, what we are, what our belief is as a Christian, in a way to give up the addiction to money. And the last thing that I was going to talk about was just the attitude about gratefulness. Once again, there's high correlations between having an attitude of gratitude and happiness. And the reason these are all connected, because oftentimes our affluenza is really the false myth that things are going to make us happy, when an attitude of thankfulness is actually much more powerful. Doing things for others is much more powerful. So it's really about busting myths, okay? And the belief that God will provide under all circumstances, and believing that really inherently and deeply and profoundly. My goodness, what a key to giving up affluenza in order to really seek true joy. You guys are all here, you're all so wise. I feel like I'm talking to just a bunch of a room full of wise people, who probably could teach me a lot. And I think that's actually the beauty, I think, of our church community. And also many of you here who can have the opportunity to share that message that sometimes only comes with maturity to younger people. And I would ask that you take those opportunities when you have them to do that. Because our young people are often pretty stressed out. And a lot of times they're stressed out because they are suffering from this disease. And like no one ever gets to the deathbed and says, I wish I had worked harder. We all know that. Living life backwards sometimes, from the deathbed going backwards, is a pretty powerful way to think about living your life. To know, not having any should-haves or could-haves. But do you have any questions or thoughts about this topic that might be enlightening to other people in the room? Your own personal experiences, perhaps, with... Go ahead.
Well, one of the most interesting things that Phyllis and I have ever done is a few years ago we went to Bhutan, which is a small landlocked country sandwiched between China and India on the south side of the Himalayas, and it's a poor country.
Yeah.
It's a kingdom, but it's a kingdom that's run as a democracy. And they don't have a lot of money, so they don't have a thing, they don't do gross national product as a measurement, and it's not a huge population, and so every year they do a survey which is called Gross National Happiness, and they poll every person in the country to find out how happy they are in 5 or 6 different categories as to whether they have enough food, whether they get along with their government, and things like that. And then they publish it. And that's how they rate how their year has been and is going.
Yeah.
And they publish the Gross National Happiness Index,
Wow.
as opposed to a gross national product.
We saw the king's car go by at one point, and he was in an SUV. And so,
He wasn't driving,
No.
he was in just a regular little SUV.
Yeah.
and their children were beautiful and happy, and they all sort of had the same type of costume type clothing, it was traditional clothing, but they were all extremely well educated, and they just radiated happiness. It was really, but they're also about 99% Buddhist.
Yeah, which that's why I kind of brought up the quote there, because Buddhists at the core, preach a giving up of things. In fact, I would say Lent is really a tradition of many of our religions of the narrow and the path, right? Of the mystic religions, which is, and this is why the topic of the whole series is giving it up. It's that, the path towards nirvana or whatever is a path of letting go. One of the most powerful little exercises I ever did in the class when I was at Yale was to do a class on death and dying. And we all had to take a piece of paper and write, a 20 piece of paper and write down things that we identified with. It's very powerful. I would suggest you maybe try doing this at home. And, so I put down like mother and wife and daughter and, minister to be and my house, just things, things that are the most near and dear to you. And then we go through this narrative, so now you've been diagnosed with a terminal illness, or whatever the narrative was. You have to start letting some of these things go. Let's say one of them was a tennis player, and you no longer can play tennis anymore. So you have to get rid of the tennis player, piece of paper. And pretty soon, as your health diminishes, your choice options become narrower. It really makes you identify what is the core of your being and what it is that you really, really, really value. For some people, that was really, really tough. And this was actually in seminary. So in the perfect world, all of us would have had God as our last piece of paper. And I think probably most of us did, just because of the context that we were in. But if you try to do that in a place where people weren't so God-focused, but other-focused, I just kind of wonder what will be the last piece of paper. We were with friends over the weekend, and John shared the story of his grandfather who had made a lot of money in Florida doing not so, somewhat, he admitted, somewhat unethical things. But he ended up with a lot of money, and it wasn't all gained so honestly. Well, the people that he screwed kind of eventually screwed him, until the only thing that he had left over was his Rolls Royce. So when John graduated from college, his grandfather drove the Rolls Royce, up to Canton, New York, to St. Lawrence for Barney, was an attorney for Barney. And so all of John's friends to this day, and we were with another attorney brothers of Barney's over the weekend yesterday, they all thought John came from real money because his grandfather drove Rolls Royce. It was the last thing he had left in all hands. He lived Johnson lived in a tiny, teeny little hovel apartment, but the Rolls Royce was outside the door. So I guess it just bears the question is it things that we hold on to as our identity, or is it a God or a belief that we are indeed God's beloved child? As a minister, many people, I've watched older people, have to sell their homes, in order to afford to live. Just live a life that's more manageable, right? Because just things are things. And I know many of you still have that conversation. And sometimes it's difficult. But once again, it's difficult sometimes, most difficult, not for the people who have no choice in the matter financially. It's people who have to really struggle with the identity of the things. And the ones that are really, the home is, and a home is a wonderful thing. A home is full of memories, and memories to be created, and it's not a financial problem, and there's more, and that home becomes a place where you are still giving, because your children are gathering, or you're feeding animals, whatever. That's all wonderful. It's really not so much about the symptom as it is, what's going on inside of you. Because life is narrowing. Inevitably, it is. So, anything else? I wish we had more people here, I think, who are suffering from these things, because I think I just preached to the choir this morning. But you're a beautiful choir.
Thank you.